HelloStavanger! There's no other way to start this thing than saying that. So, hi everyone, and welcome to my talk. As he said, dream machines and walled gardens. We'll get back to whatever that is about. This is a story that starts out in Chicago in 1937 with the birth of a boy called Ted. Ted Nelson, he was the child of two big Hollywood names. Ralph Nelson, his father, was an award-winning director that was known for his visionary style. He would create the films like Lilies of the Field that won Sidney Poitier his first Oscar, and Celeste Holm, his mother, who was also an Academy Award-winning actress. But this might be the start to a fairy tale, but it's not. This was far from glamorous. With big-name parents like that, their marriage collapsed just as soon as it started, and Ted was adopted by his grandparents. That put him in a very special situation. His parents, legal parents, and grandparents were now the same people. So he was in a secure place, but at the same time a bit displaced, with sense of identity and everything. He was in a world that wasn't quite his own. But this was a different world from the world that his parents lived in. His grandparents, now parents, were not Hollywood stars at all. They were intellectuals. And he moved into a home that was filled with books. There was literature everywhere. The shelves were stacked with all the classics. And it was an environment where reading was not only encouraged, it was expected. And from a very young age, Theodore Nelson lived his life inside of books. He lived his life inside of texts. And little did we know at that young age that these early formative years of his life would be the basis for his entire life project. So, of course, being a young kid at this time, alongside all of the big literary classics that his grandparents had, he developed an interest in science fiction literature as well. One in particular, L. Ron Hubbard's Old Doc Methuselah, was one of his big favorites. This was before he went all out and got crazy with the Scientology thing. But this is a tale of a wandering physician who travels across the universe and heals people as he meets them in different spaces. And this gave Ted a sense of infinite possibility. You can go places, make lives better for people in any place you are. So one of the big inspirations at his young age. But it was not until his teenage years that he came across The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which is another pulpy science fiction novel. And this one is about a team of scientists who travel across the universe on a spaceship, and they always get themselves into trouble. So they meet aliens, have alien encounters, and they need to solve the problems that arise from that. Now, all of these scientists are specialists within their own domains, and as it always happens when you have specialists in their own domains, there are debates between what is the best way to solve this. There is one person on the spaceship who is what is called a nexialist. This is a word that appears in this book that was coined by the author. And a nexialist is someone that is not a specialist in any particular field, but has the ability to bridge across the different ones. And this really struck a chord with young Ted. And he knew from then on what he wanted to become in life. He wanted to become a nexialist. So much that he actually drew his own business card. Theodore H. Nelson, nexialist. And this was no joke. This was dead serious to him. This was his mission statement for life. A card that he could take with him and carry in his pocket. So, their home, being a very intellectual and academic place, you would also have contemporary magazines, such as Life magazine. And these would be found on the dining room table. And just as naturally as you would discuss the day's events, you would also read aloud from these magazines on things that were happening in the world, discussing the things that you read. And in 1945, Ted picked up this issue, the September 10 issue of Life magazine, and in there he found an article that would make a big impression upon him. It was entitled, As We May Think, and it was written by Vannevar Bush. Now, Vannevar Bush was President Roosevelt's scientific advisor during the Second World War. And he was the person who oversaw all of the big programs that the United States government ran during the wartime. So he was a big name. He was incidentally also the first ever scientific advisor that the US government had. But he is a person that made a big impact. In this thing, however, he does not look back at the wartime years. Instead, he looks into the future, and into a future where we will have peace. This is a very optimistic essay where we think about what amazing things we can do in a peaceful world. And in this essay, he discusses loads of different things. There are ideas for inventions like wearable computing. There are things like tablets in there. And remember, this is 1945. A bit ahead of his time, Mr. Bush. But one particular thing I want to bring your attention to is this thing up in the left-hand corner. This is a device called the Memex. And this desk is, in fact, a computer. Inside of this thing, you will have different devices that can store things on microfilm, which was the probably most advanced storage medium that you had at the time. And on this microfilm, a person would store all of their books, all of their notes, all of their records, all of their articles, and all that. That's not the genius thing about the Memex. The Memex would have this typewriter-like interface and some levers that you could pull to create associations between the things that you had stored on microfilm, to connect different pieces of information, and also that you could bring this microfilm to your friends, to your colleagues, and share it with people, creating a universe of information. It was not limited to indices or reading a page straight down. This was all about connections. Around the same time, young Ted also walked past a florist. And outside that florist shop, he saw a sign that read, "Flowers by wire." This made him really, really curious. Now, this was, of course, the florist telegraph delivery's slogan. And that was a network created by florists across the entire United States, meaning that you could walk into a florist in New York, order a bouquet of flowers, and have it delivered to someone in Los Angeles, for example. You can still do this. You can go online and do this. So if you have loved ones out there, I recommend using the flowers by wire service. But young Ted Nelson did not see this as a marketing slogan. He took this literally. And this really made him think about loads of things. How do you take something like a flower and take it apart so that it can be transmitted across a telephone wire or across radio? This was not the kinds of thoughts that you would expect a 10-year-old to have. But he was thinking about this, and he really gave it a lot of thought about what are parts, what makes up a flower, how do you represent the scent of a flower, and last but not least, how do you reassemble that at the other end? So, at the age of 10, Ted Nelson was already thinking about what we today know as protocols, how to transmit information over networks. And these thoughts were in his mind all the time. He decided to get an education, as you should do, and he went to Swarthmore University. He did not pursue any science classes or things like that. He decided to go more towards the arts. And he studied just about anything that was interesting to him. Philosophy, film, writing, creative writing. Of course, he was an Excelist. He wanted to be across all the fields that were there. And the thing he was working on while there, he was to create new forms of publication. He self-published some really interesting, well, call them magazines, call them pamphlets, call them what you like. They were sort of origami formed, so they were different from everything else. You would unfold them in particularly interesting patterns. The information that was written on there was highly unstructured, and there was no clear guidance on how to read it. There was so much creativity in Theodore Nelson's mind at this time, and he knew about computers, but he was not really involved with them. Instead of learning that, he went to a university that gave him a creative lens. But he spent a few years trying to get into Harvard. And after several attempts, he managed to get admitted. And when he was there, he was introduced to computing for the first time. And these computers were at that point locked away in laboratories, not available to anyone, but this sparked an idea in his mind. Because he saw these computers at that time were known as calculating machines. That's why they were called computers. They were doing computing. But he saw them as something entirely else. He saw this as something, a tool, a technology that could unleash and unlock human imagination. And that was where the spark really was ignited.
The research program that I'm going to describe to you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive, instantly responsive to every action you had, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute.
So in December 1968, a young engineer called Douglas Engelbart took the stage to give a presentation that would change the world forever. For an hour, other engineers sat in stunned silence, watching as he presented a revolution. On the giant screen behind them, Douglas Engelbart used a device he called a mouse to click through different interactive computer operations that he could do on screen. Text appeared in Windows. He edited documents live on screen. He did teleconferencing with a colleague of his, miles away at a different location. This has later been known as the mother of all demos. And it's a milestone in computer history. Everyone was amazed. Well, except for Ted Nelson, that is. Ted had seen all these things before. He had visited places like Xerox PARC and Stanford and seen what the scientists and engineers there were working on. And he had seen these systems for collaborative editing, and yes, he found them interesting, but to him, they sort of missed the point. What he saw were engineers trying to recreate what we already had with typewriters, with telephones, and they were not unleashing that imagination and creating that vision that he had had since a kid. So he would start working on improving upon the ideas that he had seen. Now, so in the mother of demos, one of the demos that was done was that they edited the Declaration of Independence live on screen. Everyone was amazed by this. What Ted saw was just overwriting the text that was already there. This was not part of his vision. Because he had read William Burroughs at this time. Has anyone ever tried to read a William Burroughs novel? A few unlucky people in the room. Why do you wish this upon yourself? So William Burroughs is known for a particular style of writing, and it's a cut-up technique. So the scholars who study Burroughs have sort of tried to recreate his text. This is from the book we just saw, and it might have looked something like this originally. But he would take scissors and cut up his writings into words, sentences, whatever, and then just jumble them and rearrange them into something different. And this was exactly what Ted Nelson wanted editing to be like. It should not be erasing the words you already had written and then overwriting them with something else. It was a process of editing. That is why this was called an editor. And he got the money to start his own development project while at Harvard, creating the Juggler of Text editor, or JOT for short. If you have really good eyesight, you might be able to read something of certain importance at the very bottom of the screen there. It says a hypertextual editor. And this was UI-wise and UX-wise just similar to the thing that was shown at the Mother of all demos. You would have a text and you would go in and edit it. Same thing. The only difference was how this was stored. Now, tapes were the storage mechanism of choice for everything in computing back then, and Ted Nelson stored everything as a stream of data onto tape. And when you made a change, like we saw here, replacing dog with cat, you would not rewind the tape and change the original content. Instead, you would record the change of the word at a specific position to change from dog to cat, and then just append that information to the tape. So in his JOT editor, the big innovation was not in the way this appeared to the user. It was all about what happened behind the scenes. In 1965, Ted Nelson wrote a paper that he presented at the ACM conference in Cleveland with a highly unusual title. The title was A File Structure for the Complex, the Changing, and the Indeterminate. And he described this in the paper with the title at the top, the hypertext. This is the first time ever that word is used in writing. And Nelson, in this paper, explains his vision about what hypertext should be. And he says, the original idea was to make a file for writers and scientists, much like the personal side of Bush's Memex, that would do the things such people need with the richness that they would want. But there are so many possible specific functions that the mind reels. These uses and considerations become so complex that the only answer is a simple and generalized building block structure, user-oriented and wholly general purpose. That is a fairly powerful mission statement for what you want to build as a system. And this was 1965. People were building entirely different sorts of computer systems then, and this was even before the mother of all demos had happened. So when Douglas Engelbart, in the mother of all demos, clicks something that for us today would appear to be a hyperlink, it's a concept taken from this seminal paper by Ted Nelson. It is hypertext. So hypertext was meant for just about anyone. It was for writers, it was for thinkers, it was for ordinary people. But in the 1960s and early 1970s, pardon me, computers were always found behind locked and closed doors. They were not available to the public. Sorry about that. It was controlled by what Ted Nelson described as the computer priesthood. It was serious gatekeeping, and everything was highly guarded. And you can imagine this as the priesthood standing in front of their holy mainframe computer, keeping people at a distance because they will not understand the sacred code of the holy machine. They would talk to you in arcane language that you could not understand. Or as Ted Nelson put it, they spatter you with unintelligible answers. When people ask the questions, how will I ever learn about computers if I'm not allowed to use one? You will not understand this. This is too technical. And this is where Ted Nelson comes running on stage with his manifesto, Computer Libs, saying that you can and must understand computers now. That's the headline for his self-published book that was released in 1974, Computer Lib. This was something that he created entirely himself. He wrote it all up on typewriter, drew illustrations by hand, sold it for $7 by mail order. And this book is something that exposes something that Ted Nelson called the deep dark secret, which is that anyone can understand computers. And everyone should understand computers, because computers will have such a big impact on society that it should not be reserved for a select few members of the computer priesthood to use. This is for everybody and should be there for everyone. So this is a manifesto that reads more like a call to arms than a textbook on what computers are about, even if that is part of it as well. On the flip side of this, if you turn the book around, you would find another book bound back to back with Computer Lib. That book was called Dream Machines. Hello, welcome to this talk entitled Dream Machines and Walled Gardens. Because Computer Lib was only half the story. And where Computer Lib told and educated people about what computers were, Dream Machines was a vision about what computers could become and what computers could do. In 1816, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote his famous poem, The Kubla Khan. It opens with the lines, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree." And in this poem, he describes an underground landscape of caverns and caves and flowing rivers. And this matched Ted Nelson's vision of what the future of computers were to be. So for the project that he describes in Dream Machines, he chose the name Xanadu. And with taking a name from poetry and literature, he makes a very bold statement. He distances himself from the cold world of computer engineering and sets out on a mission to create a new form of literature supported by computers. In 1974, people did not have computers at home. Computers were only found in special places. Still, as we have learned, it was guarded by the computer priesthood. So one of the things that Nelson envisions in his Dream Machines book is that you would have something like Xanadu cafes, computer cafes that ran on a franchise model, just like McDonald's, that you would find across the United States, primarily the world after that, where people could come, sit down at a computer terminal, and tap into the vast network of all the world's knowledge and information. This would be a very social place. It would be a cafe where you would socialize with other people. You would not sit alone at these terminals. You would be together with your friends, with your family, and you would not only consume information, you would also be expected to create and contribute, endlessly adding to this ever-growing interconnected system of knowledge that was to become Xanadu. This was not a specialist tool for engineers. This was for everybody. And long before the web, Nelson imagined something like this that he hoped that would be a literary revolution. Which brings us to another publication by Ted Nelson, Literary Machines. First edition was published in 1981. He used something called a Saxon copier to create the cover for this one, which was beautiful in blue silk screen style and mirrored because of the printing process. Making this thing made his home smell like vinegar for weeks. There might be some people in the room who are old enough to have experienced something copied on a Saxon copier machine. If you've ever had a blue copy that was a bit wet and smelled of vinegar, anyone had any of those? Oh, yeah, you had. I had as well. We had one of those when I went to school. That was an experience. Anyway, this was made with such a machine. And Literary Machines differs very much from Computer Lib and Dream Machines in the sense that this is more a technical specification. because now he has spent, well, the good part of 5 years working on realizing this vision he had for Xanadu. This one is 1987 edition of this one. There were several copies of this published throughout the 1980s, and he was continually developing the concept of what Xanadu would become. The book is written very much in his spirit and the idea of hypertext as well. It has a very non-linear structure, so you would be expected to jump back and forth while reading this. But the important thing about this book is that it introduces some very important concepts. One of them is the concept of linking. We all are familiar with the web as it is today, and you put an anchor tag with an href in there and it points to somewhere. Those are one-way links. Xanadu would not have that. It would have bidirectional links with everlasting references. So when you had one item of information linking to another one, the other one would be aware of the reference to it. And those references would be kept intact. Even if things changed, they would still be the same. So this is basically what Google went on and did with their PageRank algorithm and built their entire search engine empire upon. With Ted Nelson's concept of hypertext, this would be built into the linking system itself, and it would be explicit, it would be permanent, and it would, most importantly, be visible to the user as well. So, fully transparent. But this did not only apply to things like linking from page to page, as we do with our websites today. A very important concept he also invented and coined a term for is transclusion. Transclusion is the process of quoting something, because when we write and create things, we often reference other people's works. We quote people and use other people's material in our own works. Now, academia has very strict rules for how to do this, and writing academic papers, you need to be very diligent by getting this right. In the Xanadu system, this would be built in. So the reference would follow the same rules as any other bidirectional links. And changes to a quote could be reflected in the material that quoted it as well. But most importantly, it would not do as we do today. Because when we quote things, we go copy, paste, done. We replicate and reproduce pre-existing things. This would carry a breadcrumb trail so you could go to the source of any information you would find. Also, as we saw with his storage concept, with the tape, you would never, ever delete anything or overwrite anything. Everything would have its own version. And whenever you change something, you would create a new revision of the document. This is very much like the things we are doing today. If you think about things like, God forbid, the blockchain or a Git repository, that process of always appending and never removing things from history, that was a built-in capability of Xanadu. And one reason for this being very, very important to Ted Nelson was that a book that had been very influential on him was George Orwell's 1984. And for those of you who have read that book, and this is a mild spoiler, I hope you can forgive me if you haven't read it. Shame on you if you haven't read it. Go to the nearest bookstore and get yourself a copy, because this one is one of those that you have to read. But one of the things that he was really scared about, that George Orwell writes about in 1984, is the process of erasing and rewriting history to have control over the people. This is sadly something that we see happening in the world today. And things are being deleted. Historically important records are being deleted from the common knowledge of the web. That would not be possible to do if the web had been built on the Xanadu architecture. Another concept that he had in there was that anyone and everyone was expected to contribute, and you could annotate anything that you found on the web. So if you were reading an article, just as you would do with a newspaper article, you could take out a pen, jot down little remarks in the margin of that. Those would become permanent records on the system. You could see other people's comments on the same thing. Now, this is very reminiscent of what we today call social media, where you go out and comment on things. And remember, the Xanadu cafes, Ted Nelson wanted the experience of consuming and creating information to be a social act. So this was also part of this. He kept on working throughout the 1980s, having strong funding to build this. He had a team of engineers and programming working around him, continually implementing the Xanadu project. In 1984, milestone in computer history. The Apple Macintosh arrived. And most people saw this as a fulfillment of the vision that Doug Engelbart had brought to the world at the Mother of All Demos in 1968. The Apple Macintosh had all those things. It had the mouse, it had the windows, it had the interactive editing of documents. Unsurprisingly, Ted Nelson was not impressed. He saw this as just another attempt at recreating what we already had. He has famously said that the word processing software, such as Aldous PageMaker, was just a digital version of the good old typewriter where you could much easier change the typeface. So he felt that instead of focusing on the experience of literature, creating a new literature, the structure of how things tied together, we were just playing around with layouts and fonts. So again, he felt like people were missing the point. So even if many of the things that he were trying to build were already available to the public, Computer Lib had happened, so computers like the Apple Macintosh were found in many homes around the globe. So he was halfway there. But the grand vision of Xanadu still wasn't there. He kept on building, though, but Ted Nelson is a man of visions. He is a man of ideas, and whenever they stumbled upon challenges in building the Xanadu infrastructure, he always came up with something new. And having that background, being the child of Hollywood stars, having an education in film and the arts, he always went back to those to reference the medias that he knew. And one of those were, of course, film editing. So when they were tackling the problems of how can we efficiently have all of these different diverging versions of our content, and at this stage, content was no longer just text, it was anything. It could be sound, it could be films, any sort of media that would be part of this great, vast, world-spanning global network of knowledge and information would be available. But you realize that these things diverge. So when you edit film, he thought about how you can sit down, take a pair of scissors, and just cut the film strip, and then tape it together with something else, changing the storyline entirely. He had some side projects at the same time. He was into interactive films, working on that, so this was very much inspired by that. But he came up with a storage system known as Zigzag. And Zigzag was basically an addressing system allowing all the content, sort of all your transclusions, all your links and references, to have unique addresses forever through a concept known as tumblers. I will not go into details of how that technically worked. Go pick up a copy of Literary Machines and you will find all of the details, technical details in there. This is not a technical talk, by the way. Hey, welcome to this talk. A few years later, the web happened. Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web offered a simple system of documents linked together by these one-way links. It was crude compared to Ted Nelson's visions and dreams, but it was easy to implement and even easier to adopt. And the big breakthrough came in 1994 with the release of Netscape Navigator. Because then suddenly the web was no longer just a research project, it was in the hands of millions. And just with one click, you could get from one page to another, navigating this marvelous maze, almost as complex as this building, of information found. And Xanadu had been in development for decades. This was, of course, a very bitter moment to Ted Nelson. But at least there was something for him in there, the back button. The back button was found in the Netscape Navigator browser, and the back button was invented by, guess who? Ted Nelson was the father of the back button. So whenever you click back in any old application, please give a thought to Ted. So, if Xanadu has not become the web that we want it to be, the legacy is still there in the back button. But what if? What if things had evolved a bit differently? So let's go back to the 1960s, where young Ted coins the term hypertext. A few years later, he lays out the vision for Xanadu. Now, Ted Nelson was a person who thought about products. He wanted to build Xanadu into a commercial project that he could make money off. Hence the reason for the franchises, all the cafes and so forth. This was a closed system. It was not open. So he wrote a product specification. But what if he didn't do that? What if instead Ted Nelson created what some of the other scientists and engineers who were building that things that would become the internet and the World Wide Web, something like the hypertext linking protocol, and wrote a specification for that. Then maybe when we get to the 1970s, and I for sure hope that he would still publish Computer Lib, because that book was definitely needed to free computers from the shackles of the evil engineers and scientists and professors and people with doctorates in the laboratories of universities and corporate places. What if he published some requests for comments on things like bidirectional links, transclusion, document versioning, and so forth? When he then published Literary Machines, that might be a paper for the Hypertext Standards Working Group, and bringing us to the point where Tim Berners-Lee creates the World Wide Web, drawing some inspiration from the things that Ted Nelson had published with one-way simple links. Let's erase that. And instead, let's introduce the very first browser, Mosaic. But instead of that being a web browser, maybe that could be a hypernet browser that would be able to navigate the underlying structures defined in literary machines that we have come to learn is Xanadu. If that happened, let's go to Y2K, when one of the big problems that really screwed up the entire internet was that we had piracy. And people were building content farms, hosting things, and every corporation across the globe was breaking everything to try to combat piracy. Well, I'll tell you what, Ted Nelson developed his transclusion concept into something called transcopyright. This is described in literary machines. And since at this point, any form of content could be part of this vast network of information, if a musician published their music online and someone consumed that information through transclusion, through direct linking, the reference would be there, and transcopyright was a concept that Ted Nelson came up with for paying people for whenever you use their content. So if you quoted someone in an article, a little bit of the revenue would trickle back down to the author of the original content. This would mean that if we had something like Napster, absolutely fucking fabulous. That would be a great way for musicians to distribute their music, and we would have the built-in mechanisms to pay them, because with these microtransactions, people would probably have the will to pay for the content. That might have happened. Sadly, it did not happen. Instead, we got to the 2010, which is more or less the beginning of the period we are in now. And Ted Nelson famously said that humanity is trapped in systems of invisible walls, specific conventions created by hidden techies, sometimes long ago and never questioned since. This is the legacy of the computer priesthood. But what we have created, instead of this open network of information owned by everyone, we have these systems with invisible walls. Walled gardens. Hello everyone, welcome to this talk entitled Dream Machines and Walled Gardens. Social media could be entirely different because you could comment on just about everything. The entire web would in itself be social from its foundations if his ideas had been the ones that everyone followed instead of what we have now. Which, I guess, leads us to the time where we could contemplate things. Look into the crystal ball. Look into the present and our near future. Because one of the big problems with information online, be it the web, be it social media today, is that you cannot trust anything any longer. There is a load of disinformation going on. But if everything had been built on the concept from Xanadu, things like fact-checking would actually be part of the thing itself, because you would have the lineage of all the information that you consumed would be available. You would be able to find the source of this and decide whether or not this comes from a credible place. Is this information quoted in this newspaper article credible, or is it some shit that someone just made up? you would have the ability for everyone to annotate onto everything, bringing in their perspectives of things, and the majority of people do not do this information. Only a select few do that. So hopefully that would be solved. Let's imagine a 14-year-old musician sitting in his bedroom and trying to create a new piece of music, deciding to sample some jazz great like Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, taking material from that, putting it into his digital audio workstation in the bedroom and using that. Well, that's okay. We probably do not need to do sample clearance, which is the problem with making music in that way, because of the idea of trans-copyright. Every time that gets played, the hearers of Miles Davis will get their money's worth from that. And the problems with sampling, except for those not liking it for artistic reasons, which is perfectly fine, would be very solvable. We would not need lawyers to clear licensing agreements and so forth. And we have this alien organism that is consuming all of the information ever created by man across the entire internet, across every library on the entire planet, known as generative AI. Okay, you can think many things and have many opinions about Gen AI, but one big problem is that this is probably the grandest example of theft we've ever seen. Someone has created that content and holds the copyright to everything. They are not being compensated for that. Again, Xanadu would have the concept of transclusion and trans-copyright, paving a way for these generative AIs to actually have the trail back to where does this information come from, making maybe generative AI a bit more reliable, but also making it fair in the sense that you pay for the shit that you use. So all these things could have been solved if we had Xanadu instead of the web and the internet and everything we have today. Ted Nelson is 88 years old now, and he is at that point where he might sit and read Harvest of Yesterdays. Recognize this book. Keep a keen eye open.
It's been very lonely, but I've been absolutely sure of what I've been doing all the time. So one of the main definitions of paranoia is believing what nobody else believes. So one cure is for the patient to change his mind and believe what the rest of the world believes. That is the low road. The other, by which I hope to cure myself, is to persuade everybody else. And then I will no longer be paranoid, but recognized as having been right all along.
Thank you, Ted. And thank you for coming to this talk. I hope you have a great conference party. And if you stick around, see you 8:45. Thank you for coming.